In this video, we're going to talk about election mechanics. Anytime we discuss election mechanics, there are four important components to consider: the district, the ballot, the franchise, and the formula. In this video, we're going to talk about the franchise. And when we mention the franchise, what we're talking about is the right to vote. Who can vote in a given jurisdiction? In places where everybody can vote, we call that a permissive approach to the franchise. Conversely, we could have a restrictive approach to the franchise, where there are certain groups of people that are not permitted to vote. And it's also possible that voting might be required by everyone, by law. And in those countries, we call that mandatory voting. One of the most common restrictions is an age-based restriction. It is very common around the world to have a minimum voting age. And for about 200 countries, that minimum age is 18. There are also some exceptions. The countries in blue on the map have 16 as a minimum voting age, and the countries in red have 21. But 18 generally accepted as the most common minimum age for voting. Some countries also place restrictions on the right to vote for people that are incarcerated, people that are in jail, in penitentiaries, serving sentences. Now, in some countries, Canada, Finland, and Sweden, everybody can vote regardless of whether they are incarcerated or not. Now, in some jurisdictions, incarcerated people can vote depending on the type of sentence they're serving or the length of sentence. Austria, Germany, and Japan have those types of restrictions. In a lot of jurisdictions, you can't vote. If you are in jail, incarcerated people cannot vote. A few examples include Brazil, Portugal, and the United Kingdom. And the last category is the permanent loss of voting rights. In the United States and Mexico, for example, if you are incarcerated, you're serving a sentence, you lose your right to vote permanently, at least in some jurisdictions within those countries. That is called disenfranchisement. The removal or loss of the right to vote is disenfranchise. And so in some jurisdictions, being guilty of a criminal offense, serving time, you lose your right to vote forever. Now, what about voter registration? An important part of the franchise is actually figuring out how to get people to vote and to validate their identity. You want to know how many people in your country are eligible to vote. And there are some different practices for that. Many countries around the world, at least throughout Europe, some of Africa, and almost all of South America, have mandatory registration where people are required to register to vote. And it's also possible that that might be automatic. A few countries use automatic voter registration, such as India, where the Central Tax Collecting Authority, as it's documenting all of the citizens, is also adding them to the voting roll. And so it's a good example of the government sort of using that information in one spot to also add people to the voting list to make it easier for people to vote. That would be a permissive approach. A more restrictive approach to the franchise would be voter-initiated registration. And in the United States, many states have burdensome registration processes. And throughout the history in the United States, those have been used to deliberately make it difficult for people to vote. And so again, using that spectrum of permissive versus restrictive, voter registration is a part of that. And lastly, some countries enforce mandatory voting, where people are legally required to show up to the polling station. Now, in many of those cases, you can spoil your ballot or you can select none of the above. But in places like Belgium, Italy, Greece, and Australia, voting is mandatory. Now, what kind of penalty are we talking about? It's usually a monetary fine if you do not show up. And for people in North America, it would be probably analogous to a parking ticket. So it's not a crippling financial burden, but it's enough that you don't want to be stuck with that. So just to recap, when we talk about the franchise, that is the right to vote. And there are many different approaches to that, whether you want to have a permissive voting system or restrictive. Some of those restrictions might be age requirements, registration processes, limits to voting based on whether you're incarcerated or not. And even in some places, voting is mandatory. Everybody needs to show up.